Chapter 3. ATTLEE in Newfoundland, holding on for Britain. In the summer of 1942, Clement ATTLEE, the Dominion Secretary, came to Newfoundland for a tour of the country and a rest. He was preceded by his secretary, Alexander Clutterbuck, the author of the infamous ATTLEE Report. On his arrival, High Commissioner Charles Burchell wrote a confidential memo to Norman Robertson at the Department of External Affairs in Ottawa. Mr. P.A. Clutterbuck of the Dominion Office is arriving in St. John's on Monday. He was secretary to the Royal Commission in 1933, commonly known as the ATTLEE Commission. There are few people in Newfoundland who have a good word to say for the ATTLEE Commission today. It is, in fact, exceedingly unpopular. The mystery to me is why ATTLEE should come here at the present time, or even send someone from the Dominion's office, such as Clutterbuck. Officially, I do not know anything about Clutterbuck's visit, nor do I know what his present standing in the Dominion's office is. I am wondering if he is an important enough person for me to ask to the luncheon for the Governor General. I now have 36 invitations and 36 acceptances, as per the enclosed list. These, with my wife, my daughter, and myself, make a total of 39. I have seating accommodations for exactly 40 people, but that is the limit. I therefore have one seat vacant and would appreciate hearing from you by cable on Monday as to Clutterbuck's standing and whether or not he is of sufficient importance as representing the Dominion's office to be asked to the luncheon. I do not want to make inquiries about him around here. Robertson replied, United Kingdom's authorities here did not know of Clutterbuck's arrival. They were under the impression that he was to be a member of the party accompanying the other person mentioned in your letter. Under the circumstances, it would probably be a suitable and gracious act for you to invite Clutterbuck to your dinner. By the way of underlining the need for confidentiality, Burchell added in a following correspondence. You will note that the Fishermen's Workers' Tribune is suggesting that Clutterbuck's visit is for the purpose of conspiring to rush Newfoundland into Confederation. It is amazing to discover from time to time to what a large section of the people the thought of Confederation is sort of a nightmare hanging over them all the time. For example, I am enclosing herewith a very interesting editorial which appeared in the Evening Telegram, in which the writer, probably Mr. Jeffreys, the editor of the paper, says, It is something more than a coincidence that this talk of, or more correctly, in some quarters, fear of, Confederation with Canada should crop up so regularly when discussions are held between the Commission of the British or Canadian leaders. Burchell got on well with the governor, Sir Humphrey Whelan, but he had little understanding of the workings of the Dominion office in Newfoundland. Clutterbuck was, in fact, head of Newfoundland's affair at the office at the time the secretary to ATTLEE during his visit. Officials in the government of both Great Britain and Canada in the early 1940s, and even in different departments in the same government, were often ignorant of each other's affairs. But the situation was about to change. Clutterbuck came to lunch, and Burchell was impressed with him. As a month later, he was with ATTLEE too, after their tour of the island. In September, on the eve of their departure, Burchell wrote again to Robertson. I thought ATTLEE was very adroit. I can't pronounce that. in turning aside the issue of Confederation, asked in a press interview whether he would discuss Confederation with Ottawa officials. His answer was that he would not take the initiative of raising that or any other questions. You will note that the Evening Telegram says that the reply seems to have turned discussions of his visit away from Confederation to the possible return of responsible government. I find also that in some quarters, at least, Clutterbuck is highly regarded, in spite of the fact that he was secretary of the ATTLEE Commission. I take it that Mr. ATTLEE and Mr. Clutterbuck are both giving a good deal of study and thought to the present form of government and perhaps may evolve some improvement. On the other hand, the fact must be kept in mind, in fairness to the commissioners, that the people of this country are difficult people to deal with. This country has been so badly governed during the whole period of its history of over 400 years that I think it is inevitable, and no matter how good a government may be, it is inbred in the people here to be always in revolt against governmental authority. The Newfoundlanders' well-developed skepticism and spirit of independence were not qualities appreciated by Ottawa, at least not for purposes of assimilation. Following this visit, ATTLEE and Clutterbuck continued to play key roles in British Newfoundland right up to the handover to Canada 6 years later. In November, ATTLEE wrote to Governor Whelan, "Secret and personal. Since my return from Newfoundland, I have been thinking over my impressions, although there appears at present to be little or no demand in the island for any constitutional change. While war conditions continue, it is clear that we ought to be turning over in our minds the various possibilities that may rise as soon as the war ends. And I am anxious to make as much progress as possible in working out with the Commission of Government and agreed lines of policy in order that we not be caught unprepared by events. The present conditions is the result of a contract with the Newfoundland people, which was confirmed by the Newfoundland Act of 1933. And no matter how strong the case might be on merit, it would not be open to us to vary the terms of this contract of our own violation without the express consent of the other party to the bargain. In other words, if Newfoundland could not be regarded as self-supporting and there were a general demand in Newfoundland for the restoration of self-government, it would not be practicable to refuse it. This assessment was an entirely accurate description of Great Britain's contractual and constitutional obligations to Newfoundland. It is unfortunate that when he later became Prime Minister, ATTLEE would do exactly the opposite and unilaterally vary the terms of the original contract with the people of Newfoundland and consider the case for Confederation on its merit. His reference to the various possibilities after the war is a fair warning that the constitutional course in Newfoundland was about to take some curious turns. In his reply to ATTLEE on January 7th, Whalen suggested, after a flight of imperial fancy, what one should meritorious case might be. He also indicated an apparent willingness to stray from the terms of the Newfoundland Act. So I think this is from the Newfoundland Act. Number 6, it may be that financial solution lies in the political incorporation of this country in a larger unit. Number 7, in the connection, the possibility of some association with Great Britain on the Northern Ireland pattern should not be ruled out. We do not think that distance any longer precludes such a possibility. Number 8, the only other political incorporation which deserves consideration and confederation with Canada. It may be, as you assert, that confederation is unlikely to be accepted to public opinion in either country. We feel that on a plausible, I'll just spell that one out for you because I have no idea what it means. plebiscite. In this country, at the time the assertion would be proved true. Canada's present and growing interest in this country, her fear of an increase of United States influence, her desire to acquire the Labrador, are all powerful factors. At no time has our bargaining position been so favorable, and it is doubtful if it ever will be so again. That the Dominion's office entertained thoughts of joining Newfoundland to Great Britain along the lines of Northern Ireland, with Newfoundland. MP sitting in the Parliament at Westminster, shows the reach of imperial thinking even in 1943. Whalen's casual reference to the British bargaining position in relation to Newfoundland suggests the true British perspective. Fully 100 years after self-government had been granted, Britain still regarded Newfoundland as its own, to possess or dispose of at will. Governor Whalen was wrong in his prognostication on Confederation. The British would have an even better opportunity to sell Newfoundland to Canada in 1948, and for a much better price. If conditions were propitious for Confederation in 1943, however, the timing was not. Newfoundland's option was almost unanimously against any union with Canada. It would be an uphill fight for Canadians to win the hearts and minds of Newfoundlanders and capture the prize of Labrador. There is clear frustration and even resentment in Bruchel's gloomy dispatches to Hugh Kinlan's side at External Affairs about his own country's miserable history on the island. It appears that February 16th is the 9th anniversary of the Commission of Government. I am enclosing an editorial on the anniversary which appeared in the Daily News of today's date. I am also enclosing an article by the Wayfarer in the same paper. I do not usually agree with much of what the Wayfarer has to say, but I think he pretty nearly hits the nail on the head this time. I do not think the British government can be at all proud of the fact that they set up this form of government here. Neither do I think that as Canadians we can take any pride in the fact that there were two Canadians, C.A. McGrath and Strabon, sitting on the ATTLEE Commission, which recommended that doing away with responsible government and the setting up of the Commission of Government. Nor do I think Canadians can take much pride in the fact that they stood aside when the people of Newfoundland were in the deep depths of despair in 1933. That was the time, if ever, that we might have been a real help to Newfoundland, and we did nothing except allow two Canadians without any experience or background in constitutional matters to sit in judgment on them. Jack Pickersgill, Prime Minister Mackenzie King, Private Secretary, was listening to Bruchel's lament. He, along with the influential Justice Minister Louis St. Laurent and External Affairs Officer R.A. Mackay, and Hugh Kinlinside, was very much in favor of Canada taking Newfoundland into Confederation, and they consistently pushed the Department of External Affairs in this direction. Pickersgill Memorandum of May 1943 put the best face on the situation in Newfoundland and reads like a pep talk to Bruchel. The Canadian attitude to Newfoundland is very like the American attitude to Canada, an amicable indifference coupled with a complete ignorance of local susceptibilities. Assuming that it is of first importance to Canada to maintain and extend our position in Newfoundland after the war, and if possible to incorporate Newfoundland into Canada, and assuming further that we can only accomplish these ends with the consent of the Newfoundlanders, it is clear that every effort should be made now to win their goodwill, and equally that no opportunity should be lost in presenting them in a favorable light as possible to Canadians. It is suggested that a program looking to these ends should be mapped out jointly by Executive Affairs and WIB Wartime Information Board, and that WIB, with discreet assistance from the High Commissioner, undertake to implement it. Needless to say, it should all be done unobtrusively and in a simple spirit of neighborliness, but there should be no doubt that it was being done by Canadians. Marginal note: simple like a serpent. In June 1943, a question in the House of Commons in Ottawa from J. W. Noseworthy, MP for South York, about the state of Newfoundland after the war drew this premature and now fateful reply from the ever cautious Mackenzie King. If the people in Newfoundland should ever decide they wish to enter the Canadian Federation and should make that decision clear and beyond all possibilities of misunderstanding, Canada would give most sympathetic consideration to the proposal. In London, at the Dominion's office, Clutterbucks observed with interest that Mr. Mackenzie King's statement follows very much the line one would expect. Reading between the lines, this certainly suggests that Canada is not prepared to adopt a more forthcoming attitude than in the past, but I fear that there is little likelihood of the statement influencing Newfoundland's opinion. The Dominion's office was also moving slowly towards formulating its post-war policy on not returning responsible government to Newfoundland. To help it along, the year after his own tour, ATTLEE sent over a goodwill mission to report back to the UK government and Parliament and to suggest the next constitutional step for the island. Many in Newfoundland were surprised at the arrival of another fact-finding mission too soon after ATTLEE and Clutterbuck's extensive visit. It seemed to them that Newfoundland was getting a lot of attention but very little information or action. The Goodwill Mission, composed of Sir Derek Gunstone, Charles Ammon, and A.P. Herbert, arrived in St. John's in June 1943. Herbert, the independent member of Oxford University, was a published author, something of a wit, and a highly regarded member of the House. He was also Newfoundland's champion in the British Parliament for the return of self-government, as promised by the terms of the Newfoundland Act of 1933, as Jim Haley recalled. I met Herbert in Corner Brook that summer. I was walking back from a tennis game with Tommy Williams when I saw him across the street. I knew who he was and what he was doing here, of course, and introduced myself. We were both staying at the Glen Mill Inn, so we had lunch together, and he asked me, What do you and your friends see for Newfoundland after the war? Oh, I said, we're going with the United States. Why do you think that? He asked. Well, just look around. I said, there's Americans and American activity and American money all over the island. We'd be crazy not to go with them. In St. John's, Herbert and his colleagues had extensive discussions with Governor Whelan about the possibilities of some form of future elections on the island. The idea for an elected council or national convention was being discussed in the local papers, initially suggested by R.B. Job, a prominent Water Street merchant. It appeared to Herbert as a possible mechanism for Newfoundland to request the restoration of responsible government. He also had several conversations with Charles Burchell, not all of them satisfactory. On their last encounter, Burchell reported to Norman Robertson. Herbert and Captain Rowland followed me, and as we were leaving, he put out his hand to say goodbye and told me he was leaving tomorrow. As he was shaking hands with me, he said to me, Keep your hands off Newfoundland. Somehow or other, I managed to keep my Irish temper under control, but I could not help making the statement that some of us who lived in the Dominion are trying to build up the British Empire, but some people who live in England are trying to break it up. As I was walking away from him, I heard him mutter to himself, Canadian banking in Newfoundland, and Canadian life insurance companies. The return of the Goodwill mission to Britain once again focused the attention of the Parliaments on Newfoundland. Many MPs besides Herbert were troubled that the United Kingdom continued to maintain a benevolent dictatorship on the island. Frustrated with the reason offered for the continued delay in returning responsible government, Beverly Baxter, the MP for Wood Green and a popular novelist, declared, "We do not give self-government as a prize, as a lollipop. We give it as a command. When Newfoundland owed us money, we put in the commissioners. We have heard it is now paying us money. I would say that we have had on deposit in war loans about 10 million. Suppose we cannot pay it when the war is over. Will Newfoundland be entitled to send 3 commissioners to Britain and close this house? It sounds absurd, certainly, but the principle is the same." Bartel Bull, the MP for Enfield, asked ATTLEE the obvious question that troubled the members. How in the world, without a parliament in Newfoundland, can we find out whether the people of Newfoundland have made a request to Great Britain for Dominion status, or return to self-government, or however you wish to put it? In his final report to Churchill's War Cabinet on the return of the Goodwill mission in November 1943, ATTLEE concluded, "In view of Newfoundland's important role as a naval and air base, we should clearly wish to avoid any disturbance of public opinion which would distract from the war effort. There should be no change in the present form of government while the war lasts. As soon as practicable after the end of the war, what is the war in Europe? We must provide machinery for enabling the Newfoundland people to examine the situation and to express their considered views as to the form of government they desire. One proposal for the solution of this problem which appeals to me is that made by Mr. A.P. Hubert, MP, that a national convention should be set up after the war, composed of members representative of all classes and interests in Newfoundland, and empowered to discuss and determine among themselves, with the guidance of constitutional lawyers from home, and form a government to be recommended both to the Newfoundland people and to the United Kingdom government." This memo marks the first official mention of the National Convention that Herbert had discussed with Governor Whelan and others in St. John's that summer. However, when the terms of reference for the convention were ultimately released by the Dominion's office in December 1945, they included 2 key changes that in effect subverted any intention of returning responsible government to Newfoundland. By then, the British had determined that they must control the constitutional situation in Newfoundland completely. The threat of increased American and even Canadian activity displacing British in the North Atlantic, as well as some sense of responsibility for their own obligations, eventually drove the Dominion's office to prepare a comprehensive, even generous policy of reconstruction in Newfoundland, with the international spotlight increasingly focused on the island. A horrified cry arose from the bowels of the Dominion's office. There must be no imperial slum on the back door steps of the United States. Faced with the failure of direct British rule in the form of the Commission of Government and the de facto rebuilding of Newfoundland around the American bases, British felt compelled to announce its own plan to rebuild the country. The commissioners in St. John's were so used to receiving so little from the British Treasury that they were visibly surprised at the generosity and magnitude of the assistance contemplated. When Lord Cranborne, the Dominion Secretary, told them at a special meeting in London of his plan to spend £20 million on the island's reconstruction, the commissioners appeared, however, to be of the opinion that if the scope and purpose of the scheme were to be made public prior to the holding of the referendum on the constitutional issue, the Newfoundland people's mind would be made up for them in advance, and that there was little doubt that there would be an overwhelming vote in favor of a return to responsible government. The commissioners felt that with such generous financial support, Newfoundlanders would feel comfortable with responsible government again and reject Confederation with Canada. The political argument for denying Newfoundland any funds for reconstruction as a necessary condition to induce Newfoundlanders to vote for union with Canada was apparently not recognized by the Dominion's office, either in this instance from the Newfoundland Commissioner or later by the Canadian themselves. Perhaps the British plan for a generous reconstruction would have surprised the Newfoundland commissioners less if they had been privy to the plans Lord Beaverbrook had prepared for Churchill's War Cabinet to restore Dominion status to Newfoundland. Beaverbrook, the Canadian champion of empire, was born William Maxwell Aitken, the son of a Presbyterian minister in Newcastle, New Brunswick. He became a self-made millionaire and later a press baron in England. For 50 years, he was part of the British political establishment. In the First World War, he was a minister in Lloyd George's War Cabinet, and during the Second World War, he was Lord Privy Seal and the Minister of Aviation Supply in Churchill's War Cabinet, a close friend of Churchill and a celebrity in his own right. He possessed a larger-than-life personality and of original mind with very definite opinions. His report stands in complete opposition to ATTLEE's views. This controversial and highly sensitive document was released by the UK government only in the winter of 2010, and it demonstrates a dramatic split in the War Cabinet over policy in Newfoundland. Beaverbrook presents a far more explicit and striking appraisal of the actual situation in Newfoundland, along with the imperial determination to maintain the island within the strictly British sphere. Most startling, The report contains a blunt warning to Churchill and the War Cabinet that the UK government's position in Newfoundland was not only unconstitutional, but illegal. At this time, the autumn of 1943, the War Cabinet was meeting in underground bunkers. Bombs were falling overhead, and the outcome of the war was still uncertain. Nevertheless, Beaverbrook was uncompromising in his condemnation of the Commission of Government in Newfoundland. His report is also fascinating for what it implies about the reason for the British takeover of Newfoundland in 1933. It is a powerful indictment of British policy in the island and is reproduced here in full. Memorandum from Lord Privy Seal to War Cabinet of Great Britain, London, November 18, 1943. Newfoundland should be offered the right to resume Dominion status at any time during the war and after. The claim to put forward that the present Commissioner of Government is unconstitutional and its act will inevitably be challenged. This contention is based on Clause 1 of the Newfoundland Act 1933, which makes it clear that the suspension of the Constitution was limited by the terms of the address to His Majesty by the Legislative Council and House of Assembly of Newfoundland to a period until such time as the island may become self-supporting again. But Newfoundland is now self-supporting, so it is argued. It has a surplus of $11 million. Therefore, the legal basis of Commission of Government has been destroyed. Now, if we neglect to give self-governments to Newfoundland, we must be prepared to meet and destroy this argument. It is my view that we will fail in convincing the people of Newfoundland. Newfoundland has lent us $8 million, most of it interest-free. It has given $500,000 to the Spitfire Fund for the purchase of aircrafts, and by voluntary subscription among the public has provided another $150,000 to that fund. The agitation in Newfoundland for the restoration of self-government is widespread. Practically all the newspapers participate in the campaign. Among them be mentioned the Daily News of St. John's, the Grand Falls Advertiser, the Fishermen Workers Tribune, the Observer Weekly, the Evening Telegram, the Newfoundland Trade Review, and the Western Star. The Newfoundland public is entirely dissatisfied with the Commission, and the unpopularity of the body grows steadily. 6 trade union leaders met in St. John's on the 13th April and passed a resolution for the restoration of self-government. The Newfoundland Board of Trade, meeting on the 29th March, passed a resolution asking that representatives' government be set up as a matter of urgent need. There is resistance in newspapers, amounting to claims of repudiation of the transactions relating to the basis. The claim that the Newfoundland government fell through corruption is not now accepted. It is believed that the measure was taken to benefit bondholders and supply Canadian banks with repayment of their overdraft. In fact, it is believed that Canadian banks helped to precipitate the financial crisis. The advantages of a restored Dominion status are manifold. It would be a protection against Canada's unjust claim over Goose Bay and the pretensions which the United States will advance to civil air bases in Newfoundland. With Dominion status, Newfoundland will safeguard our imperial interest in the Western Atlantic against any ganging up by Canada and the United States, always a possibility under a different government. It is hard not to notice the urgency in the tone of this memorandum in expressing the fear of losing Newfoundland to either the Americans or the Canadians. When the Imperial Conference of 1931, via the Statute of Westminster, confirmed Dominion status for Newfoundland, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and 3 other countries, there was some criticism that in the case of Newfoundland, the Dominion's office was putting the trappings of an elephant on the back of a mouse. Beaverbrook's reason for restoring the status in 1943 suggests what had motivated the British to bestow this status on Newfoundland in the first place. In 1931, the British already had significant investment in Newfoundland. They were keenly aware of the island's strategic importance to them and had plans for larger investments in aviation at Gander. Conferring Dominion status on Newfoundland allowed Whitehall to keep the Americans and the Canadians out while securing their own investment in the island and their position in the North Atlantic. The financial crisis of 1933 had only occasioned a change in strategy to one of direct control. Dominion status was therefore a much about protecting British interests in the North Atlantic, as was establishment of the Commission of Government. The 1939 memo from J.W. Harbison at the Air Ministry to Sir Charles Dixon at the Dominion's office had already revealed that Newfoundland was the key to British air supremacy. Indeed, it had always been British policy to keep the Americans and the Canadians out and to preserve the island as a British bastion. By 1943, however, Beaverbrook's confrontational stance was out of step with the independent agreements forged by the Allies during and after the war, and in particular with Churchill's and Roosevelt's understanding about Newfoundland. Perhaps even more to the point, Beaverbrook's uncompromising view of the contracts between Great Britain and Newfoundland in the Newfoundland Act of 1933 could only make UK government uncomfortable as it prepared to maneuver around it with the establishment of a controlled national convention at war's end. Ultimately, the only ganging up in the North Atlantic would be by British and Canadians against Newfoundland. In St. John's, Governor Whelan was dubious about the value of any sort of national convention, or more particularly about his ability to control it. In a long telegram to ATTLEE on February 12, 1944, he reported that public reaction to the rumors of such a convention was not positive. We observe observe that you also feel that some sort of referendum to the people as a whole may be unavoidable. A dozen or so letters have appeared in the press, and without exception, they have condemned the proposal to set up conventions or other machinery on the grounds that the simple issue with which has to be decided is the retention of commission government or the return to full responsible government. The new proposal represents a serious departure from the simple terms of the ATTLEE recommendations, and there is no power in anyone in Newfoundland to agree to a variation of these terms except a responsible government. With his plan of establishing a national convention in Newfoundland, ATTLEE was indeed straying from the terms of reference of the original contract of 1933 in an effort to control the constitutional outcome. But this variation is exactly what he had claimed only 15 months earlier to Wayland as not open to us. In this debate, the governor of Newfoundland stood with Beaverbrook. Wayland clearly disapproved of the departure from the simple terms, just as he disapproved of the novel constitutional process now envisioned. I can't pronounce that one either. ENVISAGED by the Dominion's office. He reminded ATTLEE, "It is by no means certain that the Newfoundland legislature in 1933 would have consented to the suspension of the letters patent if the door were left wide open to permit any other form of government to succeed government of commission, that the only relinquished. There was no thought in 1933 of any change in the permanence from the government. The clear and inescapable implication in the new proposal is that Newfoundland's financial troubles were in large measure bound up with her form of government and may possibly be avoided in the future in another form of substitute. This implication has been seen by several writers in the press during the past year or two and strongly resented them. Wayland was clearly correct in his view of the last Newfoundland government's understanding of the Newfoundland Act. That was certainly Prime Minister Alderdice's understanding when he wrote, "A full measure of responsible government will be restored to the island when we have again been placed upon a self-supporting basis." Moreover, it was also Churchill's understanding of the Newfoundland Act when he reassured Cordell Hull, the American ambassador to London, that the least basis agreement between Britain and America would remain unaltered upon the resumption by Newfoundland of the constitutional status held by it prior to the 16th February 1934. In case ATTLEE, the Dominion's office secretary, was in any doubt about Wayland's own view, the governor of Newfoundland declared, "We ourselves are firmly convinced that for all practical purposes there will only be two possible alternatives open to the country, either a return to responsible government or a continue with the same or substitute substantially the same system of government as that now in force. In the long run, it will be much better for Newfoundland to have responsible government restored immediately. This was forceful language from the Newfoundland governor. Whelan went as far as he could in stating his disapproval of the UK government's constitutional scheme. He was, however, an appointed leader, not an elected one, well aware of the way his views would be received by his superiors in Whitehall. He added dutifully, "We submit this statement of our views to you with sincere regret that we should seem to doubt the wisdom of a course of action to which you are already committed by a statement to the British Parliament, and with an assurance that we shall do our utmost to implement successful whatever decision you may reach." Clearly, Whelan would have to go. Despite official reassurance, he was not the man for the job ATTLEE had in mind in Newfoundland. Rather, ATTLEE would require a willing and aggressive partner in the final push to put Newfoundland into Confederation. The governor who owed his position to ATTLEE and who would not be adverse to using that position to promote the Prime Minister's personal agenda on the island. Shortly after the return of the Goodwill Mission, a bitter controversy erupted in the Newfoundland press over Canada's new base in Goose Bay. The St. John's Board of Trade protested that the Goose Bay deal was an unacceptable giveaway by Great Britain of assets vital to Newfoundland's future. Let me just read that again. The St. John's Board of Trade protested that the Goose Bay deal was an unacceptable giveaway by Great Britain of assets vital to Newfoundland's future, and that the extension of the 99-year lease to Canada was totally unnecessary. The Canadians they charged were seeking to establish post-war civil aviation rights on Newfoundland soil. The British resisted signing the lease until the summer of 1944. However, on June 27th of that year, Norman Robertson, Under Secretary of State for External Affairs, wrote to the British Deputy High Commissioner that if Canada did not get Goose Bay, then British would not get the financial package of war aid promised to John Maynard Keynes. The British got the message, and the Canadians got Goose Bay. Having won the fight over Goose Bay, and aware that London would be announcing constitutional changes for Newfoundland in early 1944, Canada's Department of External Affairs formulated its own policy paper on Newfoundland. It included a long list of the advantages and disadvantages of the incorporation of Newfoundland as a 10th province of Canada. The advantages were cautiously, even reluctantly, calculated as greater freedom in any crisis in the Atlantic, probable enhancement of our position as a world power if we maintain defense commitments, possibly a better bargaining position in the matter of civil aviation, possibly more effective control in export fish markets, control of iron ore deposits, Labrador, may conceivably be of future importance politically and economically. The Canadians were more definite, even enthusiastic about the perceived disadvantages. Newfoundland would certainly be a considerable financial liability. Newfoundland would probably be a political liability. We might expect constant agitation for better terms. It would be extremely difficult to fit Newfoundland into the existing pattern of Dominion-provincial relations. Canada's defense establishment would have to be considerably larger in order to maintain effective defense of her greatly extended Atlantic frontier. Nevertheless, in spite of a myriad objections, in January 1944, Canadian policymakers came to the conclusion that the United Kingdom government should be informed that Canada is prepared to consider seriously the incorporation of Newfoundland as a 10th province if and when it should become clear that there was very general agreement among Newfoundland people to join Canada. Having declared themselves, the Canadians were at last emboldened to nudge the British with a request that they be included in the coming constitution proposal for the island. This request resulted in a flurry of top-secret telegrams and memos. The first on November 17, 1944, from Malcolm MacDonald, the British High Commissioner in Ottawa, to his superior, Lord Cranborne, the Dominion's Secretary. Mr. Norman Robertson has asked me in course of conversation whether I know anything about an early proposal statement of the United Kingdom government future policy in Newfoundland. He said there were rumors of this here. If there is to be such a statement, he suggested that it would be an excellent thing if it contents could be communicated to the authorities here. Before publication, I think he will think of this more as a matter of courtesy than as an opportunity for consultation. Is there any news on the subject that I can give them? Lord Cranborne replied, we had already intended to discuss this matter with the Canadian High Commissioner on his arrival, and arrangements are in hand for this. Alexander Clutterbuck at the Dominion's office in London followed through with the details. My dear High Commissioner, with reference to our discussion with you about Newfoundland, I now enclose for you personal information, a copy of a note outlining our ideas. The moment for consulting the Canadians will come as soon as we have got Cabinet approval in principle for our scheme. I enclose also a copy of the note which I wrote on the approach to Canada for the purpose of our discussion with the Treasury. This you saw when you were here. P.S. I enclose also a copy of a further short note given to the Treasury today with a view of knocking down some of their arguments on the dollar difficulty. This exchange puts an end to the guessing games, and from the point forward the British and Canadians began working together on the Newfoundland agenda without the knowledge of the Newfoundlanders. The approach to Canada was a long and comprehensive document. In it, Alexander Clutterbuck outlined with far-ranging, blunt opinions and just a hint of exasperation both the British government's position and Canada's changes in Newfoundland. The writing is Clutterbuck's at his best, and it gives us a fascinating glimpse of the British perspective on Canada and a picture of the political social position of Canada and Newfoundland near the end of the war. The approach to Canada. The general position in relation to Canada is as follows. Although Newfoundlanders as individuals get along well with Canadians, the large number of them have settled in Canada. Relations between the two countries have been marred by a long background of mutual suspicion and distrust. The traditional Canadian attitude towards Newfoundland has been one of detachment, condescension, and even contempt. In the background, there has been the conviction that Newfoundland was too small and too poor to be able to stand by herself in the modern world, and that one day, when it had tired of its struggles, the island would fall into the Canadian lap. In the meantime, however, Canadians were in no hurry to add to their burden by taking over the island, with every prospect that it would prove more of a liability than an asset. Newfoundlanders, on the other side, were well aware that this was the Canadian attitude, and the result over the years was merely to increase the jealousy and suspicion with which all Canada's actions in relation to the island were regarded, and to strengthen the determination of Newfoundlanders to hold on at all costs to their precious independence. Thus, in return, a traditional attitude grew up in Newfoundland that whatever fate might hold in store for the island, nothing. Oh, I lost my place. So let's start again. Thus, in return, a traditional attitude grew up in Newfoundland that whatever fate might hold in store for the island, nothing could be so disastrous for Newfoundland as entry into the cold and comfortless Canadian fold. The war has seen and marked changes in the attitude of Canada. There has, however, been no change in the attitude of Newfoundlanders. Under the stress of war, Canadians' officials' opinions has at last grasped what has always been evident for all to see, namely that Newfoundland, situated as she is at the mouth of the St. Lawrence and commanding the gateway to Canada, is essentially to Canada's defense, and that her full partnership is necessary not only for Canada's security but also for the proper rounding off of the Confederation, which would otherwise be incomplete. What has served to drive home this lesson has been the American entry into the island. As a result of the grant to the U.S. government of military, naval, and air bases for 99 years, the Canadians have also been granted similar influence in Newfoundland. But they fully realize the Americans, if they wish to extend their influence in Newfoundland, can very readily outbid them, even without any such intention on the part of the Americans. The very fact that they are established in the island will inevitably lead to closer and permanent links, commercial and otherwise, between Newfoundland and the U.S., and the lavish scale on which Americans habitually conduct their affairs, coupled with the plain fact that assured entry to a huge and profitable U.S. market would revitalize. Newfoundland's industries may cause an increased number of Newfoundlanders, notwithstanding their strong attachment to the Crown, to look upon union with the U.S. as their eventual destiny. The Canadians now realize that had they adopted a less parochial attitude towards Newfoundland in the past, there need never have been caused for the Americans to establish themselves in the island. Now that the Americans are there, they must make the best of it, but it is not lost upon them that if the island is not to swing into the U.S. orbit, Canadians' policy must now become active instead of passive, and consciously designed to break down the old barriers of mistrust, to consolidate Newfoundland's opinion, and gradually to build up an atmosphere of camaraderie and practical cooperation in which the union of the two countries could be seen to be in the common interest. This, as is no doubtly fully realized by the Canadians, will be a long process for Newfoundlanders. At present, are as suspicious of Canada as ever. Indeed, the experience of the war have served to accentuate rather than diminish the traditional jealousy and dislikes, largely because the attitude of the Canadian forces towards the people of the island has compared unfavorably with that of the Americans, who have proved excellent mixers and have won golden opinions. In this atmosphere, the Canadians dare not make Newfoundland an offer, for fear that it would be rejected, as indeed it certainly would be, and they have therefore confined themselves to friendly expressions of interest. The assurance that if Newfoundlanders themselves should wish to turn to Canada, they would be given a warm and sympathetic welcome. These assurances have cut no ice in Newfoundland, where indeed they have been received with something approaching derision. The Canadian government, who now have their own high commissioners in the island, will fully realize in these circumstances that there can be no prospect of Newfoundlanders, when they come to choose their course for themselves after the war, opting for political union with Canada. What would be the next best thing from the Canadian point of view? What the Canadians want is time to win over Newfoundland's opinion and to bring home the advantages of the union of the two countries. What would suit them before would be something which was calculated to ensure reasonable stability in the island until there had been opportunity for a policy of breaking down the barriers to take effect. This is exactly what our proposals are calculated to provide. Moreover, in so far as the reconstruction scheme proposed would be calculated to add to the country's earning power, our proposal should be doubly welcome to the Canadians, since the prospect would be that Canada, if and when she should take over Newfoundland in the future, would find herself relieved pro tanto of expenditure, which she would then otherwise be forced to incur. We recommend that in approaching the Canadian government, we should lay all our cards on the table, explain the full scope of our proposal and the motives which have prompted them to say we feel sure we can count on their sympathetic interest. The one difficult we are up against is the exchange problem, and it is on this aspect particularly that we are most anxious for their advice. We could here say that the alternative to the finding of Canadian dollar for this purpose would be to give Newfoundland a new currency of its own. Thus, both politically and financially, it would suit us best that we should finance the program from our own dollar, and our object in discussing the position with the Canadians should be to secure their acquaintances in this course. It should be added that it would of course be necessary to keep any discussion with the Canadians on a most secret basis, since any suspicion in Newfoundland that we were in touch with the Canadians regarding our policy in the island would have the most damaging results. Clutterbuck's description of the Canadian attitude to Newfoundland brought this top-secret comment from the British ambassador in Ottawa, Malcolm MacDonald. I do not think that the early part of the note entitled "The Approach to Canada" is entirely fair to the Canadian point of view, but this is not a matter of great importance, and I only mention it because I do not wish silence to be taken as a meaning that I agree with every phrase and emphasis in that note. In general, the note is true enough. The Dominion's Office constitutional plan for Newfoundland were tied to a large reconstruction package, but the memorandum prepared by Turk and Tar of the Foreign Exchange Control Board of Canada on the post-war plans of the UK Exchange Control foreshadowed the problems that the Dominion Office would have with that agency, and John Maynard Keynes in particular, about their ambitious schemes for Newfoundland. Apparently, the United Kingdom Parliament is in an extremely sentimental mood about Newfoundland at the present time, and a great deal of pressure is being exerted on the government to take steps to maintain the prosperity created by American military expenditures. Now that those expenditures are decreasing rapidly, the Dominion's office is apparently receiving information which makes it feel that there is a real danger of Newfoundland electing to link up with the United States, and feels that immediate steps must be taken to prevent any tendency in this direction. The proposal, which is being passed strongly in for the United Kingdom government to borrow $100 million in Canada to be furnished to the Newfoundland for road buildings and other development projects. The Bank of England and the Treasury are strongly opposed to any such move because it would prejudice the post-war financial arrangements which the United Kingdom will wish to make with Canada, but there is a good deal of fear that in its present mood, Parliament may force the government to take some steps of this kind. In spite of the gathering clouds at the Exchanger, Lord Cranborne remained committed to the Newfoundland strategy. On February 20th, 1945, he sent a pleading letter to John Anderson, the Chancellor of the Exchanger. My dear John, I am under increasing pressure both from Parliament and from Newfoundland itself, to follow up on our main statement of policy made with the approval of War Cabinet as long ago as December 1943. By announcing the government's detailed proposals and pressure is likely before long to reach formidable proportions, especially now that the new Colonial Development and Welfare Bill has been through the House of Commons. Whatever our short-term dollar position, parliamentary and public opinion would, I am sure, never accept a situation under which Newfoundland, alone of the independent empire, was to be promised no assistance for reconstruction and development, and this in spite of the special obligations which we have assumed for her welfare. But Anderson's reply was not encouraging. I fear that when we come to talk about Newfoundland to Canada, we shall find that it will be a very difficult and delicate discussion. Thank you for listening. The end.